The wind outside howled, its eerie whispers tapping against the windows, as the room grew colder. Sasha shifted uneasily in her bed, the sheets tangled around her limbs. The old house groaned as if it were alive, as though it had been waiting for something that was now just beyond her reach. She had never liked the house. It had a history, one that was barely spoken of, a history that was full of strange noises and uncomfortable silences. Tonight, those silences felt thicker, heavier. The dim light from the bedside lamp flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to stretch and sway, even though there was no movement. Sasha pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her breath shallow, quick. There it was again, soft, barely audible, but distinct. A rustle. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then she realized it was coming from somewhere inside the room. Her eyes darted to the corner where the shadows seemed to gather, as if something were hiding just out of view. The rustling continued. She tried to steady her breathing, but the sound only grew louder, closer. Her heart began to race, the pulse thudding in her ears. She glanced around the room, the familiar space now unfamiliar in the dim light. The floor creaked. She froze. It was unmistakable now. A soft, slow scraping, like fingernails dragging across wood. The hairs on her neck stood on end. Sasha didn't dare move, not even a muscle. There was something, or someone, close. Very close. The air grew heavier with each passing second. The scraping stopped. Everything fell silent. Too silent. The only sound left was her own breathing, shallow and panicked. But then, from the dark corner, she saw it. A figure. Pale and thin, with eyes that glimmered like glass. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The figure moved slowly toward her, its feet gliding over the floor, never making a sound. Sasha's mouth went dry, her eyes wide with terror. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. The figure stopped right beside her bed. She could feel its coldness radiating through the air, like ice creeping up her spine. Then, it spoke. A voice, hollow and distant, like it came from deep within the earth. "Why are you still awake, Sasha?" The words sent a chill straight through her, freezing her where she lay. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her mind raced. What did it want? Who was it? But before she could answer, the figure reached out. Its hand was pale, translucent, almost like smoke. Sasha couldn't look away as the hand hovered near her face, its icy fingers brushing against her cheek. The cold seeped deep into her skin, like something was draining the warmth from her body. Her heart pounded in her chest, faster now, louder. But before she could react, it was gone. The figure vanished in an instant, as if it had never been there at all. The room fell back into its eerie silence. Sasha was left in the dark, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her mind struggled to process what had just happened. Was it a nightmare? A trick of the light? But then she noticed something. A mark on her cheek. A cold, pale bruise, shaped like a handprint. Her eyes widened in disbelief. She reached up to touch her cheek, the bruise still cold to the touch, as if it were not her skin, but something else entirely. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against the pale, frozen imprint. It was real. The air around her felt thick now, heavier than before, as though it had turned solid. She stared at her reflection in the darkened window, but it wasn't her own eyes she saw staring back. No, something was wrong. Something had changed. Her breath quickened, the pulse in her throat thumping loudly. She felt as though the walls themselves were closing in around her, the room shrinking with every second. The house seemed to groan once more, but this time it wasn't the wind. It was something else, something deep within the walls. A slow, rhythmic thud, like the sound of a heartbeat. But no, this wasn't normal. It was the sound of something moving. Something large. Sasha tried to get up, but her legs wouldn't work. They felt heavy, as if they had been replaced with stone. The heartbeat grew louder, closer. With great effort, she pulled herself from the bed, her body stiff and uncooperative. The cold floor sent a shock through her bare feet, and she winced, but the pain felt distant, muffled, like it belonged to someone else. As she stood, the walls seemed to pulse, breathing with her, in sync with her every step. The thudding grew louder, faster. She turned toward the door, but it wouldn't open. It was locked. No, it wasn't locked, it was sealed shut. Sasha pulled at the handle, desperate, her hands slick with sweat, but it didn't budge. The house was alive. It was trapping her. The thudding was now almost deafening, like the pounding of 1,000 hearts. And then, through the crack in the door, she saw it. A shadow. A movement. Something large and dark, sliding toward her with unnatural speed. Her heart stopped, her breath cut off in her chest. It was coming for her. Sasha stumbled back, her mind racing. What was that? What did it want? There was no time to think. She turned toward the window, but it was too late. The shadow was already at the door, pressing against it, as though it were trying to get inside. The very air in the room felt alive, vibrating with an unnatural force, and then, with a sudden, sharp crack, the door splintered open. The shadow rushed inside. It was everywhere now, its dark form enveloping the room. She couldn't see anything clearly, just swirling darkness, suffocating her, choking her. And in the center of it all, a pair of eyes, glowing, burning with an intense, unnatural light. Sasha gasped for air, her chest tight, her legs giving way beneath her. The eyes were so close now. Too close. And then the voice returned, low and haunting, as if it came from the very depths of her soul. "Did you think you could escape?" it whispered. Her vision blurred, the edges of the world spinning out of focus. And as her body collapsed to the floor, her mind screamed for release. But there was no escape. Not anymore. The darkness swallowed her whole. The last thing Sasha saw before the darkness consumed her was the faint glow of those eyes, burning through the shadows, unblinking and cold. Her body felt weightless, as if the very ground beneath her had vanished. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The air was thick, pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. It was as though her body had been turned into stone, cold and immobile. The only sensation left was the pounding of her heart, racing wildly within her chest. The darkness swirled around her, tugging at her very soul, pulling her deeper into an abyss she could not see, but felt all too clearly. The oppressive silence was shattered by a sharp, shrill sound, a piercing scream that echoed through her mind. It wasn't hers. It was the voice of something ancient, something trapped in the darkness, crying out in agony. Sasha wanted to run, to escape, but there was no path to follow, no way out. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sensation stopped. Everything went quiet. The pressure lifted from her chest. She could breathe again, but the air felt strange, foreign. She opened her eyes, but all she saw was blackness. No light. No shadows. Just an endless void. But then, from within the void, came a voice, soft, cold, yet impossibly close. "Welcome." The word was chilling, as if the very air had turned to ice. Sasha's body shuddered as she felt the weight of its meaning press against her mind. "Where am I?" she managed to whisper, her voice trembling in the stillness. "You're where you were always meant to be," the voice replied. The voice wasn't comforting. It didn't offer answers, it only raised more questions. Her body began to tremble again, not from cold, but from something darker, deeper. Fear. Desperation. She wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, but her voice failed her. The words stuck in her throat, choking her. Then, she felt it again, a shift in the air. Something was moving in the darkness, something large, something breathing. She wasn't alone. Slowly, painfully, she turned her head, straining her ears to hear anything, any hint of movement. But there was nothing. Only silence. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, closing in around her, tightening like a vice. Then, the faintest flicker of light appeared, far off in the distance. It was small, barely visible, but it was there. Sasha's heart skipped a beat. The light grew brighter, drawing closer, and as it did, she saw the shape of something, a figure moving toward her. It wasn't human. Its form was too fluid, too unnatural, as though it were made of the very darkness around her. It came closer, its eyes glowing with the same cold light that had haunted her earlier. And with each step it took, the air grew colder, the darkness thicker. Sasha tried to back away, but her body refused to move. It was as though she was rooted to the spot, held by some unseen force. The figure stopped in front of her, its eyes locking onto hers. The cold, unfeeling gaze seemed to pierce through her very soul. "Do you understand now?" the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't just in her mind, it filled the entire space, vibrating with an unbearable weight. Sasha could feel her chest tightening, the breath leaving her body. She wanted to say something, anything, but no words would come. The figure reached out, its hand cold and twisted, just like the one that had touched her before. This time, there would be no escape. The hand hovered just inches from her face, and she could feel the frost emanating from it, creeping into her skin, into her very being. The world began to shift again, the light dimming, the darkness growing more intense. And just as her vision blurred once more, she heard it. A soft, echoing laugh. Not from the figure. Not from anywhere she could see. It was a laugh from somewhere far deeper. A place where no one could escape. A place where no one could remember. And as she was drawn into the abyss, the last thought that crossed her mind was not of fear, but of something else, a quiet, unsettling understanding. She had never truly left. The darkness had always been waiting for her. The laughter echoed in her mind, reverberating through the very marrow of her bones. It was familiar now, not terrifying, but strangely welcoming, as though it had always been a part of her, woven into the very fabric of her being. Sasha felt herself sinking, the darkness pulling her down like quicksand, with every moment taking her deeper into its fold. She couldn't escape. There was no way back. Her body felt weightless, as though it were no longer her own. She floated, suspended in an endless void, where time had no meaning and nothing existed except the oppressive cold. The light from the figure was gone now, replaced by an all-encompassing blackness. Her mind spun, confused, lost, But there was something else, something nagging at the edges of her consciousness. A whisper. So faint at first, she could barely make it out, but it grew louder with every passing second, until it filled the void with a rhythmic pulse. It was a name. Her name. Sasha. The voice was soft, almost tender, but there was no kindness in it. It was a summons, a beckoning to something ancient, something forgotten. Sasha's heart raced again, her body tense with dread. It had called her before. Now, it was waiting. She wanted to speak, to ask what was happening, but no words came. Her throat felt raw, empty. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, yet she could feel it shifting, changing. It wasn't the stillness she had become accustomed to, it was moving, breathing, alive. She wanted to run, to flee, but there was no ground to stand on. No place to hide. And then, there was a sudden, sharp pull. Like something had yanked her from within, dragging her through the cold emptiness, faster and faster, as if it were trying to tear her apart. Her body jolted as though it had been struck by lightning, the sudden movement disorienting. For a moment, there was nothing but blackness. Then a figure emerged before her. It wasn't the same one as before. This one was different, older, more ancient, and far more terrifying. It was towering, a silhouette framed by a faint, ghostly light that made it appear almost transparent. Its eyes were empty, dark voids, but they seemed to draw everything into them. Sasha couldn't look away. The figure raised a hand, long fingers curling as though beckoning her. "Come," the voice whispered once more, but now it was clear. It was not just in her mind, it was everywhere, surrounding her, flooding her senses. "Come to me, Sasha. Come and see." Her heart thundered in her chest, her breath shallow and uneven. She wanted to move, to escape, but her limbs felt bound by invisible chains, frozen in place. The figure's voice lingered in the air, filling her with an overwhelming sense of inevitability. "You have always been mine." The words hit her like a wave, crashing over her with such force that they shook her to her very core. Her breath caught in her throat, her chest tightening painfully. No. She couldn't. She wasn't ready. But it didn't matter. The figure moved closer, its presence suffocating, overwhelming. A cold, familiar sensation filled the room, crawling into her skin, seeping into her very soul. The dark eyes of the figure locked onto hers. And in that moment, Sasha understood. It wasn't just a presence. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was her fate. It had always been her fate. She wasn't here by chance. She was here because she had been drawn to it. Drawn to the darkness. Drawn to the cold. The figure reached out once more, and this time, she didn't resist. She couldn't. The moment its cold fingers touched her skin, everything went still. Her body went limp, her mind numbed by the endless void. And then, there was nothing. No light. No sound. No breath. Just an unbroken, eternal darkness, consuming her completely. She was no longer Sasha. She was nothing. Just another whisper in a silence. The silence stretched on, eternal and unyielding, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. It wasn't peaceful. It was endless. Sasha's consciousness flickered, uncertain, like a dying flame in the wind. Was she alive? Was she dreaming? She couldn't tell. But then, there was a sensation. A faint, distant tremor, like a ripple in the void. Something was moving, something that didn't belong. The silence was broken, just for a moment, but long enough for Sasha to feel it. A whisper. Barely audible, yet it cut through the quiet like a knife. Sasha. Her name. It was different this time, deeper, more menacing. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence. The darkness that had swallowed her began to shift, like something stirring in the depths of a forgotten ocean. Sasha felt it, a pull, a tug from within, something that dragged her away from the numbness, back toward awareness. Her vision, if she could even call it that, started to return, but the world around her was not the one she remembered. It was fractured, broken. Shapes flickered in and out of existence, jagged and twisted, like broken shards of glass. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. Instead, she reached out, her fingers trembling as they grasped at the air, trying to find something solid, something to hold on to. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and for the first time, she felt her body again. It was cold, freezing, and every part of her ached, as if she had been ripped apart and put back together. Then, a flash, a fleeting glimpse of light. The light burned, a harsh, blinding flash that made her recoil, her eyes squinting, her hands raising to shield her from its intensity. But the light didn't relent. It grew, filling the space around her with a harsh glow. Sasha was no longer alone. A figure stood before her, tall and imposing, its features obscured by the intense brightness. It wasn't the same shadow as before. No, this one was different. The figure was solid, its outline sharp and defined, though the light around it seemed to distort the very air. But as her eyes adjusted, Sasha realized something that made her blood run cold. The figure wasn't just a silhouette. It was her. It was her, but wrong. The eyes were the first thing she noticed. Her eyes, but not her eyes. They were empty, hollow, dark voids, like pools of black ink, endless and consuming. It smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin that stretched too wide across its face. Sasha. The voice was hers, but not hers. It was distorted, like a warped echo of something she once knew. Sasha, it whispered again, the sound sinking deep into her chest, rattling her very bones. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she tried to take a step back, but her legs felt heavy, unresponsive. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. She had to wake up. This was a dream. But the figure didn't disappear. It stepped closer, the movement smooth and deliberate, each step deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. It leaned in, its grin widening, and in the light of its face, Sasha saw something that made her heart freeze in her chest. Behind the smile, behind the hollow eyes, there was nothing. It was empty. A void, much like the one she had just escaped from. It reached out, its cold fingers brushing against her face. "Do you understand now?" the voice asked. Sasha wanted to scream. She wanted to run, but her body betrayed her. It was as if she had become the shadow, trapped in a mirror, locked in a prison of her own creation. "You're mine," it whispered. Her breath stopped, her body stiffened, and the cold of the figure's touch seemed to seep into her very soul. Her thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind, her sense of self crumbling under the weight of its gaze. And as the figure's touch slid down her cheek, she realized there was no escape. The darkness was not just a place. It was her. It had always been her. The moment the figure's grip tightened around her throat, she felt her mind slip away, leaving only the cold emptiness. And in that moment, As everything went black once again, Sasha understood. She had never truly left the darkness. It had always been a part of her. The darkness surged forward again, swallowing her whole, pulling her deeper than before. There was no longer any distinction between Sasha and the void. It was one and the same now. She couldn't tell where her body ended and the cold, endless abyss began. Her thoughts drifted in and out, fragile whispers in a storm of confusion. She had thought it was over, thought she had reached the end, but the truth was darker, far worse than she had ever imagined. There was no escape. The absence of light, of sound, of touch, it was suffocating. Her mind screamed, but no noise escaped her lips. Time no longer made sense. It was as if it had ceased to exist entirely. But even in the depths of the blackness, there was a strange, uncomfortable presence that lingered. Something was watching her. Something was waiting. She could feel it, deep within the darkness, pressing in on her from every side, suffocating her with its invisible weight. Sasha tried to move, tried to fight it, but there was no strength left in her. She was no longer human. She was part of this. And just as she was about to surrender completely to the void, something changed. A faint light appeared, a tiny flicker, far in the distance. It was so small at first, almost insignificant, but it was there. Her heart, though numb with terror, still pulsed with the instinct to survive. She moved toward the light, even though every part of her told her to turn away. With every step, the cold seemed to grow sharper, more painful, but the light grew brighter too, pulling her forward, urging her to keep going. The light wasn't a physical thing. It was more of a feeling, a warmth, a comfort, though she knew deep down it couldn't be trusted. It was just another lure. Yet, it was all she had left. Her feet moved on their own, carrying her through the vast emptiness toward that faint glow. The closer she got, the more she could make out a shape, a figure standing in the center of the light. It was her. But not her. It was her, but somehow different. The figure was standing perfectly still, its face blank, its eyes too wide, too empty. And behind it, the light pulsed and flickered, as if it was struggling to hold its shape, as though it, too, was a lie. The figure raised its hand, palm open, its fingers outstretched. The air grew thick, the darkness closing in again, but the light fought to push it back, creating a fragile barrier that kept the darkness at bay, just for a moment. "Welcome back," the figure whispered. Sasha's heart skipped a beat. She didn't want to believe it, but the figure's voice was unmistakable. It was hers. Yet, not hers. The same distorted tone from before, now echoing through her thoughts. She took a step back, but the figure's eyes followed her, unblinking, unwavering. "You have been here before," it said, the words sinking in like a cold stone. Sasha didn't understand. She had never been here before, had she? But then, the memories began to surface. Faint flashes of images, of cold hands, of shadows in the corners of her vision, of whispers at night, of the house, the one that had always felt wrong. All the pieces started to fall into place. The dark house. The figure in the shadows. The cold touch that had once frozen her. She had been here before. She had always been here. The figure's smile spread wider, twisted and unnatural. "You can't escape me," it said, its voice like ice. The light flickered again, the warmth slowly draining away, leaving her in the grip of the cold, the void, the suffocating presence of the figure. Sasha's legs trembled as she tried to back away again, but there was nowhere to go. The light was fading, the darkness closing in once more. It was too late. The figure took a step toward her, its hand still outstretched, and in that moment, Sasha knew this wasn't just a place. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was her. She had become part of it, and it had become part of her. No matter how far she ran, no matter how much she resisted, she would always be pulled back into this place. There was no escape from herself. The figure's fingers brushed against her skin, cold as death, and she felt it, a shiver, a tremor that ran through her very soul. "Welcome home," the figure whispered. And then, the darkness closed in, swallowing everything whole. No light. No sound. No escape. Only the infinite void, where there was no beginning and no end, where time and space had no meaning. And Sasha was lost, forever a part of it. The void seemed to stretch out forever, like an endless expanse where time had no hold. Sasha floated, suspended between life and death, between reality and nightmare. Her senses were numb, dulled by the suffocating darkness that pressed in from all sides. The emptiness was all-consuming, a place where nothing mattered, where nothing existed except the oppressive silence. But in that silence, she could still hear it, the faintest whisper. Sasha. It was a voice she knew, but it wasn't her own. It was coming from within, from somewhere deep in the recesses of her mind. She strained against the stillness, trying to reach for the sound, to understand it, but the more she tried, the further it seemed to slip away. The darkness thickened, swirling like a storm, and then, through the haze of her thoughts, she felt something shift, a pressure building, an awareness awakening. Her breath caught in her throat. It was as if she had been lying in wait, dormant, until something had stirred her from her stupor. The darkness started to move, to take shape. A figure, no, more than a figure, emerged from the shadows, its form indistinct but growing clearer with every passing second. The cold radiated from it, wrapping around her like tendrils, pulling her closer. It wasn't just a figure, it was a presence, a force she couldn't ignore. Sasha tried to move, tried to cry out, but her limbs refused to obey, as if they had been shackled by some invisible force. Her heart raced, thumping painfully in her chest, but she could feel no air, no wind to fill her lungs. The figure loomed over her, its features still obscured, but she could feel its gaze upon her, like icy fingers brushing against her skin. "Do you remember me?" the voice whispered. The words were chilling, like the cold bite of a winter wind, and yet there was something familiar about them. Sasha's mind reeled, her memories scattered, but they were blurry, distorted, impossible to piece together. It was as if her mind itself was trapped in a fog, unable to recall anything clearly. "Do you remember?" the voice repeated, this time louder, more insistent. "You have always been here. You have always belonged to me." The words stung like sharp needles, each one digging deeper into her consciousness. She tried to scream again, but her throat was dry, tight. The figure's shape was solidifying now, its form growing clearer, its presence overwhelming. It was a reflection of her, but twisted, distorted in a way that defied comprehension. She knew this was not just a vision. This was not just her mind playing tricks. This was real. The figure reached out, its hand hovering just inches from her face. Its touch was cold, so cold that it felt like ice on her skin, seeping into her very bones. Her pulse raced. Her breath quickened. The figure smiled, its lips curling into a grin that was far too wide, far too sharp. "You cannot escape," it whispered. "You never could." The world around her began to spin, the edges of reality blurring as the darkness closed in tighter. There was no room left for thought, no space left for escape. The pressure in her chest mounted, suffocating her, until it felt like her body would collapse under the weight of it. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the pressure lifted. For a brief, fleeting moment, Sasha felt weightless. She could breathe. The figure was gone. The darkness receded, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sasha felt empty. The silence returned, but it was different this time. It wasn't oppressive. It wasn't cold. It was peaceful. For a split second, she thought she was free. But then, she heard it again. The whisper. Sasha. Her name. It was no longer a voice, but an echo, reverberating through her mind, through her very soul. She turned, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. No figure. No presence. Only the same crushing, all-encompassing emptiness. The whisper came again, but this time it was clear, sharp, like a knife cutting through the silence. Sasha, you are mine. The words rang through her head, and with them, the truth settled in. She wasn't escaping. She was already lost. She had been lost long ago. The darkness wasn't just a place. It was her. It had always been her. And no matter how far she ran, it would always follow. It was her fate. Her only fate. The last thing she heard before everything went quiet again was a soft, chilling laugh. It wasn't hers. It wasn't anyone's. It was just the sound of the void. Of the end. Of everything. And then, silence. The silence stretched on, thicker than before, swallowing everything whole. It wasn't empty, though. No, the quiet was full of weight, full of expectation, full of something waiting. Sasha tried to grasp for something, anything, but her mind was as empty as the space around her. Her hands shook, reaching out into the darkness, but there was no ground beneath her, no way to tell if she was falling or standing still. The cold was overwhelming, an unbearable pressure that seemed to press in from every direction, wrapping around her like chains. But she couldn't feel her body. It was as if she was no longer connected to it, as if she were just a consciousness drifting in a void, untethered from anything familiar. And then, the whisper came again, softer this time, but insistent. Sasha. The voice wrapped around her like a vice, tugging at something deep inside her that she couldn't understand. She wanted to scream, but there was no voice left. There was nothing left except this whisper that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. She felt it deep in her chest, in her gut, an echo of something she couldn't quite place. The cold was growing colder, creeping further into her very bones, but there was something more, something even worse. A heaviness. A suffocating weight that pressed down on her chest, constricting her lungs, making it impossible to breathe. And through that crushing pressure, the whisper came again, louder now, sharp with malice. You can't hide from me, Sasha. Her heart froze in her chest, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she might shatter under the weight of it. She wanted to run, to flee, but there was nowhere to go. She wanted to close her eyes, to disappear into the darkness, but it was already too late. The very air around her seemed to thicken, to solidify into something tangible. It was as though the darkness was alive now, breathing in sync with her, closing in around her with every breath she took. She reached out again, desperately, but her hands passed through nothing, through emptiness, through the void. But then, she felt something. A pulse. A vibration deep within the fabric of the darkness, a tremor that was as much a sensation as a sound. It was like the world was slowly coming back into focus, slowly, but not in the way she hoped. The darkness began to shift, moving like liquid, like smoke, swirling and changing. And then, in the midst of that shifting, she saw it. The figure. Not the one she had encountered before, but one that was somehow even more terrifying. It was a silhouette, but its edges were blurred, undefined, shifting in and out of form, like it was both here and not here. But the eyes, those eyes were undeniable. They were the same dark void she had seen before, but this time, they were wider, more vacant, filled with something that made Sasha's blood run cold. The figure raised a hand, a long, skeletal arm, and pointed directly at her. "Do you remember?" it asked, its voice a low rasp that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sasha's breath caught in her throat. She tried to speak, to answer, but no words came. There was no air left in her lungs. And then, as the figure stepped forward, the temperature dropped further, too far, too fast. The cold was unbearable now, like ice sinking into her skin, freezing her from the inside out. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, and for the briefest moment, she saw something. A flicker of recognition. Not of herself, but of something deeper. Something older. "You're mine," the figure whispered. And in that moment, Sasha understood. She had never been lost. She had never been escaping. She had been here all along. This place, this dark, endless void, it wasn't a prison. It was her home. The figure stepped forward, its form now clearer, more defined, and with each step, the world around her twisted more, distorting into something unrecognizable. It was the end. It was always the end. The figure reached out, its hand like ice, its fingers curling around her throat. And as it closed the distance between them, Sasha felt her mind snap, a sudden, overwhelming flood of images, memories, thoughts rushing into her all at once. She saw herself. She saw the house, the shadows, the whispers. She saw it all. And then, she knew. There was no escape. There had never been any. The figure smiled as it tightened its grip, and everything faded into nothingness. The end. Or was it just the beginning? The grip around her throat tightened, and the world fractured again, breaking into countless shards of light and dark. Sasha tried to scream, but no sound emerged, her lungs failing to fill with air. The weight of the figure's touch was suffocating, draining all the life from her with each passing second. Her vision swam. Flickers of reality, of moments she thought she had left behind, danced at the edges of her mind. She saw the shadow in the corner of the room as a child, that ever-present feeling of being watched, being followed, but there was no one there. She saw the empty streets at night, the echo of footsteps that had always been too loud in the silence, as if something, or someone, was just out of view, always just behind her. She saw the house, the one that had stood empty for so long, but somehow still felt like home. The walls, the creaking floorboards, the whispers in the dark that never let her sleep. It all came rushing back. But the figure's presence drowned it out, its grip solidifying, pulling her back into its grasp, erasing all the warmth, all the familiarity. There was only cold now. Only the darkness. Her mind shattered, each memory splintering into pieces too small to understand, too overwhelming to contain. The figure was still there, its face too vague, too shapeless to focus on, but those eyes, those empty eyes, were everywhere, staring into her, seeing through her, hollow and endless. And then, the whisper returned. But this time, it was different. "Do you remember why you're here?" it asked, its voice like the scraping of metal, like nails on a chalkboard. It echoed inside her skull, reverberating in the empty space around her. Sasha's thoughts scrambled, desperate to make sense of the words. Why was she here? What did it mean? The question gnawed at her, digging deep, sinking into the corners of her fractured mind. And then, with a sudden clarity, it hit her. She wasn't meant to escape. She wasn't meant to fight. The figure wasn't the enemy. It was a reflection. It was her. Sasha had always been here, in this place of shadows and whispers. This was where she had belonged all along. The house had never been real. The people she had known, the world she had once lived in, none of it was true. She was the darkness, just as it was her. The emptiness, the cold, the terror, it was all part of her. The figure smiled then, its lips stretching impossibly wide, the void inside its eyes growing darker, deeper. "You remember now, don't you?" it whispered. Sasha didn't need to answer. She understood. The darkness didn't want to consume her. It was calling her home. With a final, chilling breath, the figure let go of her throat, and she felt herself falling. Not into the void, but into herself. The cold, the silence, the endless expanse, she wasn't lost in it anymore. She was part of it. As she sank deeper into the endless black, she knew there was no escape. There was no waking up, no return to what she once knew. There was only the darkness, and in it, she would remain. Forever. The last thing she heard before everything faded into nothing was the whisper, soft, yet loud, echoing through the emptiness. "Sasha, welcome home." The darkness swallowed her whole, and for a moment, there was nothing, no thought, no sound, no sense of self. It was a deep, unbroken silence, as if the world itself had ceased to exist. But then, from within the void, a faint stirring, a sensation. It wasn't warmth, but it was something. Something that made her feel more than the lifeless drift she had been caught in. It was an unsettling pulse, like a heartbeat, steady and unyielding, thumping through the emptiness. She reached for it instinctively, a desperate part of her trying to cling to something, anything, that could break the suffocating void. The pulse grew stronger, and with it came the faintest flicker of light, a soft glow that stretched through the darkness like a crack in the world. It didn't offer comfort, though. It was cold, harsh, and alien. The light began to take form, shaping into something recognizable, something that twisted her insides and made her heart race. It was the house. The house from her memories, from the shadows that had haunted her steps. The walls, the rooms, the long corridors that never seemed to end. The very place that had drawn her in with whispers in the night. But now, it was different. It was not the warm, forgotten home she had remembered. It was decaying, rotting, crumbling beneath the weight of time and silence. And at the center of it, there was something standing in the dark. A figure. No, her. It was her, but wrong, twisted, stretched out in the shadows, as though her body had been pulled apart by unseen hands. Her eyes, no longer the wide, hollow pits, were bright, glimmering with an unnatural light. A smile stretched across her face, too wide, too crooked, like it had been carved into her. Sasha wanted to scream. She wanted to run, to escape the face of the thing that was her. But there was nowhere to go. The figure reached out, its hand stretching toward her. The fingers were elongated, claw-like, unnatural. "Sasha," it whispered, and her voice, was wrong. It was a hollow echo, a mockery of what it had once been. "I've been waiting." Sasha stumbled backward, panic flooding her veins. But the house, the walls, the floor, everything around her began to warp, closing in, shifting like a living thing. The walls pressed in, the hallway twisted, the shadows seemed to stretch and reach toward her, pulling her into the dark. She couldn't escape. The figure followed her every step, its smile never fading, its eyes never blinking. "You thought you could leave," it said, its voice now filled with cruel amusement. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" Sasha's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The house grew smaller, tighter, suffocating her with its dark presence. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, this isn't real." But it was real. The air around her was thick, heavy, suffocating. And there was no way out. She reached toward the light, toward the flickering glow, hoping for a way to break free, to tear through the shadows. But the figure's hand was already upon her, grabbing her arm with a grip that was ice cold, as though the very touch of it froze her blood. "Sasha," it said again, its voice now a terrible, guttural rasp, "this is where you belong." With a jolt, she was pulled into the darkness. The last thing she saw before the world fell away was the twisted version of herself, smiling, watching her, as if everything had been part of the plan all along. And then, everything went black. The void closed in once more. And Sasha, once more, was lost. The blackness engulfed her, wrapping her in its suffocating grip. Time no longer existed. There was no sense of how long she had been lost in the void. No sense of how much of her was still intact. It was as though the very essence of her being was unraveling, thread by thread, and all that was left was the chilling stillness. The cold never left, but it had become something different. It wasn't just a physical sensation now. It was inside her, creeping into her thoughts, into her memories, poisoning everything she once knew. She could still feel the presence of the twisted version of herself, its smile, its eyes. But now, something else was beginning to stir in the distance. A soft echo, a faint sound. It was like a distant whisper, barely audible over the silence. But it was there. It was calling her name. "Sasha." The voice, the same as before, yet now it held a sense of urgency. A pleading tone. She tried to move, tried to respond, but her body felt weightless, like she was submerged in thick liquid, unable to control any of her limbs. Still, the voice persisted. "Sasha, you can hear me, can't you?" Her thoughts scrambled to find clarity, but it was like her mind was a fog. Who was calling her? Was it her own voice? Or was it the figure, the one that had captured her, the one that had taken over her very soul? It felt both familiar and foreign at the same time. And then, as if she were finally able to focus, something shifted in the darkness. The cold seemed to recede, just for a moment, just enough for her to feel a flicker of warmth. Her senses, her mind, everything that had once been swallowed by the darkness, began to piece itself together, just enough to see through the blur. She opened her eyes, or at least she thought she did. There was light. Faint, yes, but it was there. It was a dim glow, stretching like a ribbon across the blackness. A crack, a small tear in the infinite void, offering the faintest glimpse of something beyond. The whispering voice grew clearer, closer. "Sasha, it's not too late." The words sliced through the fog, breaking the endless silence. Her heart, which she hadn't realized had been silent, began to race again. She felt something stir deep within her chest, an instinct, a primal need to survive, to escape whatever it was that had been keeping her bound. The light began to flicker more brightly now, the shape of it becoming clearer. She couldn't see it fully, yet, but it felt like it was something pulling her. Something beyond the darkness. "Follow it," the voice urged, its tone full of both hope and desperation. "You have to wake up, Sasha. Wake up." The words echoed through her mind, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the idea of returning to something, to reality, to life, became tangible. With all her strength, she fought against the crushing weight, the overwhelming cold, the suffocating darkness. Slowly, painfully, she moved. She couldn't feel her body, but her mind screamed to her, "Push forward." The light was growing, swirling now, expanding into something she could almost touch. The whisper became a voice, not a call, but an urging. "You're almost there, Sasha. It's waiting. It's always been waiting." She pushed harder, willing herself to move toward the light. And then, with a sudden surge of strength, she felt herself being pulled, as if the universe itself was reaching out to grab her. For a brief moment, there was a shock of warmth. A flash of recognition. The house. The walls. The floor. The very air she had once known. But then, darkness. Once again, she felt herself pulled back into the void. The weight of the cold became unbearable, suffocating her, consuming her, and the light she had nearly touched blinked out. The last thing she heard was the voice, still pleading, still calling to her, but now distant. Faint. Almost as if it was being pulled away, out of reach. "Sasha." And then, silence. Nothing but the crushing, endless black. The silence stretched on, suffocating and relentless, until Sasha was no longer sure if she was even aware of the passage of time. There was no movement. No sound. No feeling. Her body, her mind, everything felt as though it had disintegrated into the void. The darkness wasn't just around her, it was her. She was the darkness now, bound to it, woven into it like a thread in an infinite tapestry of cold and emptiness. But then, through the thick haze of nothingness, something changed. A tremor. A vibration, soft but undeniable, traveled through the black. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A pulse. And with it, a flicker of something that wasn't darkness. A light. At first, it was only a glimmer, far off and faint, but it was enough to send a surge of panic through her. The light. It wasn't warm, but it was alive. It was movement, it was energy, it was escape. Her mind snapped back into focus, her senses slowly coming back as the pull of the light intensified. Her limbs, though still heavy, still trapped in that numb, detached state, began to ache with the effort to move. The voice returned, too. The whisper, once so faint, now louder, clearer, more urgent. It wasn't a call this time, it was a command. "Sasha, now." It wasn't asking. It wasn't a plea. It was demanding. With a sudden burst of effort, her mind screamed to her body. "Move." But there was no strength. There was no feeling. And yet, despite everything, she could feel herself shifting. It wasn't much. It wasn't fast. But it was enough. The darkness started to bend around her, warping, shifting as the light grew brighter. The space she was in, this endless void, this prison, seemed to stretch, to recoil, as if it were alive, resisting her attempt to break free. The pulse was louder now, thudding through the air, through her very bones. And then the light reached her. It was not warm. No, it was cold, sharp, like a blade cutting through the dark. But it was there, undeniable, consuming. The light pierced through her chest, through her mind, through everything she was, filling her with a force she could neither resist nor control. Her skin prickled with a sensation she hadn't felt in what felt like ages. Her heart began to pound in rhythm with the pulse, faster, louder. The darkness recoiled. It hissed, as though it were a living thing in pain, and the edges of the world around her began to dissolve, to crumble into dust. The voice became clearer now, sharp, piercing. Sasha. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It wasn't distant. It was right there, surrounding her. Echoing in her mind, seeping into her soul. Do you remember? The question lingered in the air, heavy, suffocating. Do you remember? Sasha wanted to scream, but there was no voice left. Instead, she fought the darkness, the force that was pushing back against the light. Her body was still stiff, unyielding, as if it were no longer hers to control, but she felt it, something. Something had changed. And then, there it was. A memory. A fragment. A flash of her past, of the life she once knew before the shadows swallowed her whole. A memory of walking down a quiet street, the sound of birds in the air, the sun warm on her skin. It was fleeting. It was brief. But it was enough to make her realize something she hadn't understood before. She was not trapped in this place. This was where she had chosen to be. The darkness, this thing, it was not her prison. It was her creation. The realization hit her like a wave crashing against the shore, and for the first time since she had entered this void, Sasha felt something. She felt power. The darkness shifted again, writhing, but it no longer had the control it once did. Now, she understood. She wasn't just a victim here. She was the one who had pulled herself into this place. And now, she could leave. With all the strength she could summon, Sasha reached out, her hand trembling, but moving, toward the light. It was warm now. It wasn't just the light, it was her. The dark space around her began to unravel, collapsing inward as she tore through it, like threads being severed, one by one. And in the final moments before the void consumed her again, she made a choice. She let go. The last thing she saw, before the light overwhelmed everything, was her own face, twisted, dark, but now whole, staring back at her, watching her as she disappeared into the warmth. And then, there was nothing. Just the light. Endless. Pure. The light enveloped her, a warmth that stretched through her bones, through every fiber of her being, filling the empty space where the darkness had once been. For the first time, Sasha could feel her body, feel it alive, as if she had been reborn. But the transformation was not without its price. The world around her was no longer the void she had known, but something else, something that felt unfamiliar, disjointed. She was standing on solid ground now, but it wasn't the ground she had expected. The earth beneath her feet was soft, damp, and the air around her tasted strange, as though it were thick with the remnants of a dream. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her senses overloaded. Everything was distorted, the world around her appeared hazy, colors shifting in unnatural patterns. She could hear faint whispers in the distance, voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once, a cacophony of sounds that clawed at her mind. Sasha tried to focus, but her vision wavered, her hands trembling at her sides. The light, though bright and welcoming, no longer felt as safe. The whispers began to grow louder. Sasha. The voice was different now, darker, more insistent, like the cold, hollow tone of the figure that had once haunted her. She spun around, heart racing, searching for its source. But there was nothing there. Only the emptiness, stretched wide and endless. The whisper echoed again, louder this time, but the voice was shifting, twisting, distorting as if it were being pulled, stretched thin across the air. Sasha, why did you leave me? The question sent a jolt of fear through her. It wasn't the same voice that had called her before. No, this one was twisted, wrong. Her feet moved instinctively, backing away, but the ground beneath her shifted again. The soft soil gave way, and she stumbled, falling into the damp earth. She felt herself sinking, her hands scraping against the ground, but there was no escape. The darkness clawed at her, swirling back like a storm, wrapping around her limbs, pulling her down. The light had become a distant memory. Everything she had fought for, everything she had believed in, felt as though it were slipping away. No, she whispered to herself, choking on the panic that rose in her throat. I can't go back. But the world had already begun to shift again. The ground under her feet no longer felt like earth, but something soft, something alive. She tried to push herself up, but her limbs were heavy, trapped in the relentless pull of the shadows. Sasha, the voice rasped again, the words so close now, so intimate. It was the figure, her twisted self, calling her from the deep shadows. You can't run from me. You can't leave. Her heart pounded harder now, every beat a painful throb in her chest. The darkness surged forward, swallowing the ground, the air, and all the space around her, until there was only one thing left. The figure. It emerged from the dark like a nightmare made flesh, towering over her, her eyes, gleaming with a terrible hunger. Sasha gasped, unable to move, unable to escape. You've always been mine, the figure whispered, its voice sickly sweet, almost loving. You can't escape me. You are me. The shadows twisted around her, tightening, suffocating her, binding her to this place, this moment, this nightmare. The figure reached down, its twisted hand extending toward her. Sasha, it crooned again. You can't leave, because you've never left me. Sasha's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as she tried to push away from the figure, but she couldn't. It was her. And there was nowhere to go. The figure's grip closed around her arm, ice cold, its fingers sinking into her skin. Her body froze in place, as if she were locked in the moment, caught between two worlds, unable to break free. The whispers intensified, a chorus of voices all around her, their words unintelligible, but the meaning clear. There was no escape. Not from the darkness. Not from the truth. You can never leave me, Sasha, the figure repeated, its voice now a growl, low and guttural. You are mine. You always have been. Sasha felt the world spinning, her body numb, her mind racing, trying to hold on to anything that made sense. But nothing did. The figure was her. The darkness was hers. And she was trapped within it. There would be no return. No waking from this. Only the cold. Only the darkness. And the whispers. Always the whispers. Always. The cold seeped deeper, wrapping around Sasha's chest, tightening with every breath she took. She could no longer distinguish where the darkness ended and where her body began. The figure's grip tightened, its fingers sinking deeper into her arm, like claws pulling her into an abyss. The whispers, those terrible whispers, were no longer distant. They were all around her, inside her, crawling beneath her skin. The voices twisted together, melding into one unrecognizable sound, an inhuman melody that churned in her mind like a storm of agony. "You belong here, Sasha." The words from the figure were a heavy whisper, filled with malice, as its eyes, her eyes, gleamed with a cruel, knowing satisfaction. They locked onto hers, pulling her gaze in, forcing her to see the truth she had long buried. She tried to scream, to fight back, but her mouth betrayed her. No sound emerged, only a suffocating pressure in her throat. The figure leaned closer, its face contorted into a grin so wide, so unnatural, that it was as if the very act of smiling had shattered its features, turning them into something grotesque. "You thought you could escape," the figure murmured, its voice thick with venom. "But you never left me, Sasha. You never will." Sasha's heart hammered in her chest, each beat reverberating through her body, but her body had become distant, foreign to her. She could feel herself losing touch with it, her limbs heavy, lifeless. But then, there was a shift. A flicker. A pulse. It was faint, but it was there, like the spark of life struggling to return, a fragile thread of hope in the midst of overwhelming darkness. Sasha's instinct surged. She reached for it. She wasn't sure how, but the pulse felt like hers, a part of her she had forgotten. With everything she had left, she willed herself to break free. Her arm jerked away from the figure's grasp, her body bucking against the force that held her. The darkness snarled around her, furious at the disruption, but she could feel it, just a little more of the light, just a little more of her. The figure hissed, its mouth twisting into something even darker, its form warping, shifting with an unnatural speed, trying to reclaim her. Sasha took a deep breath, her lungs burning with the effort to fight against the suffocating weight of the shadows. Her body was light now, weightless as she moved toward that fragile thread of warmth, that flickering pulse of hope. The light was growing, and with it, the darkness began to retreat. For the first time, Sasha could feel herself gaining ground, pushing back, reclaiming what had been stolen. The cold, the weight, the crushing pressure, it all started to unravel. The figure's grip loosened, its voice turning frantic, desperate, as the pull of the darkness weakened. "No," the figure howled. "You can't leave." But Sasha didn't listen. She didn't have time to. She could feel herself breaking through the veil, the wall between this nightmare and something else. With one final surge, she pushed herself into the light. A sharp, searing pain shot through her, but it was nothing compared to the suffocating void she had left behind. The light enveloped her fully now, and the voices, the darkness, the twisted figure, all of it faded. The light was warm, it was real. Sasha felt herself breathing again, truly breathing, as the air around her became thick with life. She opened her eyes, blinking against the brightness, and the world slowly came into focus. She was no longer in the void. The ground beneath her was solid, the air crisp and real. The world felt alive again, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sasha knew she was free. But even as she looked around, even as the world stretched before her, she could still hear the faintest echo of the figure's voice, far off in the distance. "You can never truly escape me, Sasha." Sasha paused. The voice was quieter now, like a fading memory. She didn't know what it meant, or if she was truly free. But for now, she took a deep breath, looking ahead into the light, into the world she had fought to return to. And as she walked, she knew one thing: the darkness would always be a part of her. But for now, she had one. And that was enough. Sasha stood still in the light, her senses reeling as the world around her seemed to settle into place. The air was warm, rich with the scent of earth and distant trees. She felt the soft brush of a breeze against her skin, the gentle movement of life all around her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was free. Free from the suffocating darkness, free from the twisted version of herself that had haunted her every thought. The grip of the void had loosened, and now there was only this reality, this world. But even as the warmth wrapped around her, a lingering cold remained, curling in the pit of her stomach. The whispers had faded, but the figure's voice, the one that had followed her, that had been a part of her, still echoed faintly in the corners of her mind. "You can never truly escape me, Sasha." The words were like a shadow, creeping into her thoughts. She couldn't shake them. She could still feel it. She turned her head, scanning the horizon, but there was nothing there. Just the quiet, peaceful scene before her. Trees swaying gently, the soft hum of distant birds, the faint rustle of wind through the grass. Was it real? Or had the darkness followed her into this new place? Was she truly free? She took a cautious step forward, her body feeling light but uncertain. Her heartbeat was steady now, but her mind was still tethered to that twisted place. "You can never truly escape me." Sasha clenched her fists at her sides, a surge of defiance flooding her veins. She wasn't going to let it win. Not again. She had fought too long, too hard to let it reclaim her now. With each step she took, the world around her seemed to become more solid, more real. The trees looked greener, the sky brighter, the air fresher. It was as though the world itself was welcoming her back. And yet, deep in her heart, she knew one truth: the darkness would always be there, lurking. But for now, it could stay in the shadows. She had one today. And that was enough. Sasha took another step, and then another, walking into the light, leaving the past behind her, for now. Sasha continued walking, her feet pressing firmly into the earth beneath her, each step carrying her farther from the darkness, from the terror that had gripped her soul for so long. The world around her felt different now, lighter, more vivid, as though every color, every sound, had regained its true essence. She could hear the soft rustle of the leaves overhead, feel the warm kiss of sunlight against her skin. It was a feeling she had long forgotten, buried beneath the weight of the shadows she had endured. With each passing moment, she felt the weight of her past, of the twisted version of herself, of the void, lessen. The whispers, once so insistent and deafening, had faded to nothing more than a distant hum, like the remnants of a storm that had passed. Sasha stopped for a moment, allowing herself to breathe deeply, fully, without the suffocating pressure of fear constricting her chest. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in what felt like ages, she felt peace. She could finally rest. The light that surrounded her no longer felt cold or sharp, but comforting. It was as if it had always been there, waiting for her to find it again. She hadn't just escaped the darkness, she had conquered it. But even as the calm settled over her, there was something else. Something subtle, but undeniable. It was a whisper, soft but clear, like the rustle of wind through the trees. "I'll always be here, Sasha." It was the voice, her voice, echoing through the stillness. But this time, there was no fear. No terror. Only a quiet understanding. She had faced the darkness, and in doing so, she had learned that it would never truly leave her. It was a part of her, a shadow that followed, but it no longer had the power to consume her. Sasha opened her eyes, gazing out at the world ahead, the sun casting long shadows across the land. She was free. And for the first time, she knew that she could live with the darkness, as long as it didn't control her. And with that, she took her final step into the light, walking forward, unburdened and unafraid. The story of the darkness, of the figure, was over. But her story, her journey, was just beginning.